All right, we're chugging right along with part 3. These are revelations, or revelation, I should say, given in November of 1830. This is section 34, and we're also going to go through 2 letters that we have. So jumping right in, the earliest version of this is also in Revelation book 1, handwriting of John Whitmer, like the others, and it is called the 37th commandment. It is chapter 36 in the Book of Commandments, and it is section 56 in the 1835 edition of the Doctrine and Covenants. There are no differences between section headings of 1981 and 2013, except for the removal of the history of the church. So kind of blew through that pretty quick. We do get mentions from the modern section headings that the revelation was given in the home of Peter Whitmer Sr. So that's the addition that we get that isn't really in these earlier versions that we have. So what gives on this one? So Revelation book 1 gives us this as a background. It says a commandment to Orson Pratt, his call to the ministry, etc., given at Fayette, Seneca County, state of New York. Manuscript history, again, we don't get anything from drafts because we're all done with those, but what we get out of volume 1, page 127 of the manuscript history of the church, which is now, I guess, the history of the church. In the forepart of November, Orson Pratt, a young man 19 years of age who had been baptized at the first preaching of his brother Parley P. Pratt, September 29th, his birthday, about 6 weeks previous in Cana, New York, came to inquire of the Lord what his duty was and received the following answer. Now, that number is very significant to the church because for the majority of the 20th century, I would say, you were called to serve a mission when you were 19 years old. That is when I was called to serve my mission. That was changed very recently to 18 years old. So basically, as soon as you're done with whatever the high school requirement is, Amazar were, for your country, once you're kind of considered that full-blown adult, you can serve a mission as a man. So that's the thing. It used to be 21 years old for women. Now it's 19 years old for women. But kind of the idea is like you're done with school and you're sort of free to go out and serve a mission. So this age of 19 and the fact that it was on his birthday is special, isn't it? So there you go. So the historical introduction to this we get from Documents Volume 1. Again, Orson was baptized on his birthday, travels about 200 miles to where his brother is staying, and arrives after Parley gets the revelation to serve a mission. So this is the previous revelation that we have. And then we get this from the historical introduction. Orson Pratt later explained that he too wanted to know his duty and requested that Joseph Smith inquire of the Lord for him. The result, according to Pratt's account, was the following 4th November 1830 revelation, dictated by Joseph Smith, in his presence and written down by John Whitmer. So there is somebody named James Van Cleve who shared an experience. He says, historical introduction says, according to Van Cleve, Pratt recounted that after he was ordained an elder in the Church of Christ, he was anxious to know what his mission was and would be. And at Peter Whitmer Sr.'s residence, he asked Joseph whether he could not ascertain what his mission was. And Joseph answered him that he would see, and asked Pratt and John Whitmer to go upstairs with him. And on arriving there, Joseph produced a small stone called a seer stone, and putting it into a hat, soon commenced speaking, and asked Brother Pratt to write as he would speak. But being too young and timid, and feeling his unworthiness, he asked whether Brother John Whitmer could not write it. And the prophet said that he could. Then came the revelation. I would probably do the same thing. Like, dude, I'm new here. I don't know if I want to do that. So John Whitmer wrote it down. Kind of special. So he gets called on his mission. And Orson Pratt later becomes an apostle of the church as well. In fact, he has a very major presence in, as I'm pointing out here, the Journal of Discourses. He actually speaks really long. I love Orson Pratt, but boy, his speeches in the Journal of Discourses they go on for pages and pages. So he could speak, and he was a very good speaker. So what's the aftermath of this? Well, the historical introduction says, though the revelation itself does not specify the area where Pratt was to preach, he later explained that his mission was to Colesville, Broome County, New York. The revelation left a deep impression on Pratt. Quote, I thought that was a very great and important calling. I felt, therefore, the importance of those sayings, and truly, When I looked at the magnitude and importance of the command given to me to prophesy by the power of the Holy Ghost, I felt oftentimes to tremble and shrink for fear I never should be able to fulfill and accomplish so great a work." Unquote. Despite such trepidations, Pratt had, by 2nd December 1830, been ordained an elder and was on his way to Colesville to begin his mission. Footnote 7 here also says Pratt carried with him a letter from Joseph Smith and John Whitmer that declared to the members in Colesville that Pratt had been, quote, "chosen, ordained, sanctified, and sent," quote, as another servant and apostle. So even though he wasn't like officially an apostle at the time, one sent forth, sort of the dictionary definition came true there. So that's section 34, another call to a mission. Next thing we get here is a letter from Oliver Cowdery, given 12th of November, 1830. Document introduction to this. This is only found in Newell Knight's history. And from a previous episode, 2 episodes ago, I believe, this one was found, like this Newell Knight history was found in a tin box in a basement in Provo, New York. So you never know what you find. But yeah, this is the only surviving copy of this. And it's an unidentified handwriting because other people helped Newell Knight make his history, and there's a lot of people it could have been. We just don't know exactly whose handwriting it is. So that's how we have this. So I think that's fascinating. It's in the Church History Library now. It was actually found many, 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 many years ago, and has been in church custody since then. So this is a story kind of about how Sidney Rigdon joins the church, and he is an incredibly large figure in church history. So it goes like this. En route to the Indian Territory in present-day eastern Kansas, one of the 4 missionaries, Parley P. Pratt, called on Sidney Rigdon, who was his former friend and instructor in the Reformed Baptist Society. The letter below suggests that the group had planned before their arrival to stop briefly in the Kirtland area and seek out Rigdon. The missionaries found Rigdon and many of his parishioners ready recipients of their message, and the letter describes their success. So these people were really looking forward to this. So just to give a history about the Campbellites, and this is where Rigdon and his people, and quite frankly, why did the church move to Kirtland, Ohio? This explains a lot of it. So for nearly a decade prior to meeting the missionaries, Rigdon was affiliated with Alexander Campbell in a mutual quest to reclaim, quote, "the ancient order of things." Campbell and his colleagues were known for their teaching based on Acts 2:38 that baptism, rather than being an experience of grace, was the divinely appointed means of receiving a remission of sins. Yet, as an early follower clarified, their call to reform Christianity did not begin nor end in baptism. It saw as its end and sought nothing less than the deorganization of sect and the reorganization of the saints in the express terms and conditions divinely set forth in the Holy Scriptures. Many reformist congregations in northeastern Ohio eventually severed denominational ties, and by the early 1830s reorganized under Campbell's leadership as, quote, "disciples of Christ." So the organization did eventually fall apart as we get from here. Quote, "Ministers of the Mahoning Association, a reform-minded branch of the Baptists of which Campbell and Rigdon had been key members, voted to dissolve." So poof, they're gone. So these people are kind of left without a home, more or less. And this kind of led to their acceptance of the missionaries. So again, from the historical introduction, about 2 months later, Pratt and his associates arrived at Rigdon's home proclaiming a restoration of ancient truth and divine authority. His prior commitment to Christian primitivism enabled Rigdon, as well as his followers, to listen closely to the missionaries. Later, an editorial in a Mormon newspaper looked back with gratitude on the Ohio converts' connection to Campbell, affirming that their minds, quote, "were prepared for the work through the belief and reception of many of the principles propagated by Alexander Campbell. And we will even go further and acknowledge that the Lord permitted the propagation of those principles as a forerunner to the fullness of the gospel, though its advocates knew it not," unquote. So, kind of fun. So what are the contents of this letter? Well, it's written from Kirtland, Geauga County. Can somebody help me out with that? How do you say this county? Geauga. I don't know. Anyway, Geauga sounds like a horn. Anyway, sorry, not being disrespectful. I just don't know how to say it. They did leave two books of Mormon, with something called the Buffalo Tribe. So on their way to Ohio, they meet a tribe of Native Americans in the Buffalo area who later returned to where they were going, but they preached to them what the story was, gave them some copies of the Book of Mormon, and moved on with their life. So kind of cool. So they did preach to the Lamanites, if you will, as they were instructed to. They then had a meeting with the Campbellites who were trying to, quote, separate from the world as much as possible. And what they basically, the Morley family decided to have a communal relationship and really separate themselves off physically and spiritually from the rest of the world, which was a semi-common practice back then. So Sidney Rigdon is one of the first 55 baptized into this new faith. So big thing. If you recall from a previous part, there were 62 members at their last conference. So having 55 people join the church is a big deal. In the letter, Oliver is also kind of requesting, we need about 500 copies of the Book of Mormon to be sent to the Kirtland area. We got a lot of work to do here. So it's kind of exciting. So some footnotes to this letter. Footnote 5, which I find to actually be quite a touching story, and I think reflects a lot of what many other families probably went through, in my opinion. Totally my opinion. But there's a message from Sidney Rigdon to his wife, whose name was Phoebe Brooks Rigdon. So just kind of sharing this from the footnote. He informed her what the consequence would undoubtedly be respecting their worldly circumstances if they obeyed the gospel, and then said, quote, "My dear, you have once followed me into poverty. Are you again willing to do the same?" Unquote. She answered, quote, "I have weighed the matter. I have contemplated on the circumstances in which we may be placed. I have counted the cost, and I am perfectly satisfied to follow you. Yea, it is my desire to do the will of God, come life or come death." Unquote. Accordingly, Mr. Rigdon and his wife, were both baptized into the Church of Jesus Christ. Now, I don't know. I guess in the spirit of full disclosure, I will say I've been married to a woman very similar to this, who, married me under not good circumstances. We lived in a small apartment, then we moved to something else. We moved to Utah during COVID, so I'm in Utah now. And we had moved 6 times and lost a lot of money doing it and just had to go through that kind of stuff. Now, I am not comparing myself to what these people went through, but to have a husband and wife agree that sometimes you're going to make a decision and there might be some bad consequences to follow it, but you're going to do it together is a very touching story to a married man. So root for Mr. Rigdon and his wife. Phoebe Brooks Rigdon seems like a very incredible woman and very eloquent in how she spoke. And again, like I said, these two had an enormous, massive, big, huge influence on the church. In a previous episode, we talked about the Joseph Smith translation. Yeah, you have it. Sidney Rigdon was a major part of it. So anyway, a very touching story. I just loved it. Gushing aside. Footnote 6, Parley recalled later, the interest and excitement now became general in Kirtland in all the region round about. The people thronged us night and day, insomuch that we had no time for rest or retirement. By the time the missionaries departed Kirtland, they had baptized 127 souls. So big deal there. So that is the letter from Oliver Cowdery reporting back to the prophet and others. So the next thing we have is a letter to the church in Colesville. So Joseph Smith is now writing letters. So whenever in the Joseph Smith papers you see like to or from, it's usually addressed to or from, the prophet. So the 2nd of December, 1830 is when this is done. The paper's introduction again is from Newell Knight's History, the thing left in a basement in Provo. Unknown handwriting because we don't know who did it in the history itself. This is a letter from Joseph Smith and John Whitmer as the likely scribes. So Joseph Smith usually would dictate these letters, and John and others would scribe them down. So, historical introduction to this letter. This letter gives instructions to the church members in Colesville, New York, in general, but also addresses Joseph Smith's brother Hiram Smith in particular. At the time Joseph Smith and John Whitmer wrote it, Hiram and his wife, Joshua Barden Smith, were living in Colesville with Newell Knight and his wife, Sarah Colburn Knight. Hiram Smith and Newell Knight were engaged in preaching in the area. The letter included a copy of the most recently received letter from Oliver Cowdery, who reported on the great success he had and his 3 missionary companions were experiencing in the area around Kirtland, Ohio. So as you read this, there's going to be a portion that's just a straight up copy of the letter we just spoke about from Oliver Cowdery, which is kind of fun. Most of these letters are now lost. So this letter, according to the historical introduction, was apparently part of an ongoing correspondence, not all of which is extant, between Joseph Smith and members of the church in Colesville. Like Joseph Smith's August 1830 letter to members in Colesville, it reflects a belief in an imminent second coming and cites international political conflict and natural catastrophes as evidence that, quote, the prophecies of the Book of Mormon are fulfilling as fast as time can bring it about, unquote. By the end of December, they were told to move in a revelation. So, to kind of put this into perspective, the church is organized April 8th, 1830, and by the end of that year, they were gone. And I may say that from the time that this was given, and we're going to get to that in December of 1830, there's hints that, hey, just so you know, Colesville and some other places, we're going to be moving to Ohio, right? And as you may have seen from a couple of episodes ago, Joseph Smith and Emma just paid off their home to Emma's parents and then never lived in it. They moved away almost immediately. So some tough decisions these people had to go through. So moving on with the historical introduction here, the inclusion of Cowdery's letter with its encouraging commentary on the work in Kirtland may have helped prepare members in Colesville to respond positively to the call to leave New York and remove to that distant location. However, no other evidence indicates that Joseph Smith was contemplating a move to Ohio prior to the 30th of December revelation, which specifically states you are to move to the Ohio. Some footnotes to this. Not really nice talking about Colesville, but the phrase Satan's seat is used in the book of Revelation. Joseph Smith may have used the phrase to describe Colesville because throughout the summer of 1830, members and believers were persecuted there. So, not the nicest thing to say about the town you're living in. Footnote 12 here says, at the time this letter was composed, Joseph Smith was in the midst of dictating an expanded account of the biblical Enoch. Shortly after writing this letter, Joseph Smith dictated a lengthy prophecy of Enoch, a portion of which dealt with the last days and the second coming of Christ. These are all mentioned in this letter that is to the Colesville saints. Kind of as a thing, like, this is probably why this is happening to us, just because it's the end of days, things like that, from what he gets from the biblical Enoch. That, by the way, the prophecies of Enoch, all those things, that would be considered later chapters in the book of Moses, which is in our Pearl of Great Price. Now, there's a word here that shows up called phials, P-H-I-A-L-S, and it is a contemporary spelling of the word vials. I thought that was interesting. However, something I would encourage when you're singing songs or when you're reading old books, it's also kind of an indication of their dialect. So if you look at the Constitution of the United States, for example, there is what looks like a fancy F, but with no crossbar on the F. That is a sh sound in the International Phonetic Alphabet. And so there's some indication that they may have that term, that phoneme, all over the place in the Constitution in the 1700s. So sometimes when you see files, that might have been like, maybe they said files instead of vials, When you're singing songs, sometimes when the rhymes don't quite fit, it's because maybe you're supposed to be rhyming the second word as if it was the first, and it'll kind of give you an indication of their dialect and how they spoke. So just kind of a side note there I find interesting, a little pastime of mine when I'm reading old stuff. And then there's this thing that is spoken. It's a phrase, beware of the Freemasons. Now, it doesn't really refer to the religion of Freemasonry. So if you're not aware, Joseph Smith, Hiram Smith were Freemasons. And a lot of our founding fathers in the United States were Freemasons. So it's not talking about the religion, but apparently footnote 25 clarifies that statement a little bit from this letter. It says, Hiram Smith belonged to Palmyra's Mount Moriah Lodge number 112. When he left for Colesville, he owed a small debt to Alexander McIntyre, the Smith's family doctor. Lucy Mack Smith paid the debt in corn and beans, but was subsequently visited by several men seeking payment. Not believing her that the debt had already been paid, they were about to take stored corn when William Smith arrived and forced them to leave. So apparently some Freemasons got a little nasty about a debt owed, which I find fun that, man, I wish I could pay my debts in corn and beans. That'd be freaking awesome. I'd grow corn all day long. But yeah, that's what it meant by that. So it was specific to these people who were looking for a debt. So it wasn't about the religion itself or the organization, maybe, if you will. Probably religion is the wrong way of saying it. The rest of the letter is a copy of Oliver Cowdery's letter, which we've already read, and Hiram Smith was the intended recipient. So there you go for part 3, some things that happened in November of 1830. So in our next part, we're going to be getting into the December of 1830 editions, and that should close us up for this episode. So stay with us. It's a long one today.